I was working with a surgeon actually in South Alabama. This was a couple of months ago. And he said, I don't believe in this. You're just the type that is adding to the cost of healthcare. And, surgical smoke is a political issue, right? I mean, in 2024, look at where we're at, our political landscape. And I thought, that's such a shame, because there are people out there, there's data out there, there's studies out there that show all of the harmful things that are in surgical smoke, whether we're talking formaldehyde, hydrogen cyanide, or benzene. It's scary stuff. And I'm like, well, you were probably alive when we could smoke on airplanes, so I can respect your point here, but you got to catch up with the times, man.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this Vendor Spotlight on First Case, Melanie and I are going to be speaking with Paul Fowler, Director of Engineering, and Calvin Hersom, Sales Trainer from Northgate Technologies, Inc., and they've got a solution for you around surgical smoke evacuation. It's the Nebulae SRS, and there are a number of benefits to this solution. What I also love, Melanie, is I love talking to the engineers who did the research and the development and the continuous improvement of these types of products. And we're going to hear all about that today, as well as the real world application. And it's pretty crazy these days. A lot of emphasis, but there are some states that still have not adopted legislation.
Absolutely. My state being one of them, we need to get on board. But you're right. Hearing from the engineers, hearing from the people who design these products, and the thought process and the just intelligence that went into designing them so that surgery could be safer for the staff, for the patients. And then, the listening to the end user and making it better every single day. It's really cool to hear their story.
All right, Calvin and Paul, up next here on First Case, Melanie and I get to dive into all things surgical smoke evacuation.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Today, Melanie and I have the pleasure of speaking with Paul Fowler, Director of Engineering, and Calvin Hersom, Sales Trainer with Northgate Technologies, Inc. We're going to be talking about the Nebulae SRS. It's a closed-loop laparoscopic smoke removal device that can maintain pressure, remove surgical smoke and contaminants while reducing your CO2 gas usage. Really excited to have both of you on the show today. Why don't we start with you, Paul? Maybe tell everybody a little bit about your background. You're an engineer, so I'm super interested into hearing what all goes into the Nebulae SRS and your development, and then bringing it to market and the considerations. So thanks for joining us here on First Case today.
Good to be here, Justin. So I am the Director of Engineering at Northgate Technologies. Like you said, I oversee both the research and development part of the company as well as the sustaining engineering. I've been in medical about 20 years. My education is mechanical engineering with a biology degree as well. And with that, I got a master's degree in biomedical engineering. And all that was before I began my 20-year career. I've been kind of all over medical, started with spinal implants. Then I worked for quite a bit in patient care. And here I am now at Northgate, where I've been for 5 years, working with surgical environment and stone management technologies.
What an interesting background, mechanical engineering and biology. It makes sense once you take that to biomedical engineering, but were you headed that direction all along, or did you just kind of have an interest in two areas that wound up merging?
No, actually, I have a brother who's a surgeon, and I figured I would follow in his footsteps. A couple years in, I still thought about med school, but I really liked the problem solving that came along with engineering. Instead of transferring, I decided to get both degrees. I figured I would be well prepared for a career where we work on developing the products that doctors use. I'd be best prepared for that, and it worked out perfectly.
All right, Calvin. Well, now we're going to have you introduce yourself. You're a trainer, so I bet you get a lot of interesting questions out there in the field and, just bringing a lot of that education. How did you find yourself in your role with NTI? And maybe tell us a little bit about, how your career path evolved as well.
Yeah, sure. Happy to be here too. Thank you for having us, Justin. I wish you would have introduced me first because I'm not as credentialed or as cool as Paul Fowler. But yeah, I'm just a salesperson. But no, so I've been with Northgate since the inception of our direct sales team. We've been around for over 40 years, designing, manufacturing, patenting these wonderful medical devices. But historically, what we've done we've stamped other people's logo on those devices. So we make this wonderful device, and then we'll put on Boston Scientific or an Arthrex or a Smith & Nephew label on there. And about 3 years ago, our board decided, why don't we take a couple of these products that we've got that we were really excited about and sell them directly to the hospital and kind of eliminate that middleman. So that's when we started our direct sales team. I was kind of part of ground zero for that build out. And it's been a journey. I'm really proud of what we've done so far. And the sky's the limit with what we're doing here, especially on today's topic with surgical smoke evacuation, as its popularity is becoming more and more prominent. I mean, it's been around since electric cautery's been around, but the awareness of the issues that are associated with surgical smoke are becoming more and more popular. So I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, it is definitely a hot topic, and I think one that clinicians and honestly too, regulatory bodies are becoming, very, very conscientious and laser focused on. So I'm very excited to hear about the technology that you've developed and how you're continuing to improve surgical smoke evacuation as well. And you mentioned all these other products. And so, Paul, I'm going to kind of go back to you and maybe expand a little bit on, what Northgate Technologies, or NTI, as we might reference throughout the interview today, is really all about, because I didn't think I knew anything about that as far as all the products that you're manufacturing, and then obviously other companies are bringing, to the market, until you decided to take some of these, direct to the customer. So can you talk a little bit more about the company and the background?
Sure. So NTI's business is really divided into two main parts. The first we call stone management. This is electrohydraulic lithotripsy. These are the electrogenerators and the probes that find a biliary stone in your body and start using shockwave technology to begin to pulverize that stone. In addition to stone management, we have surgical environment. So surgical environment has more products. We have our Nebulae insufflator. We have the SRS that we're talking about today. We have a variety of tubing sets and accessories. And we have a new device called StimSite, which stimulates the ureter and helps prevent the surgeon from damaging that ureter during surgery, helping to make a safer experience for the patient.
Now, you just mentioned the Nebulae insufflator, and then obviously we're going to be talking about the Nebulae SRS for smoke evacuation. Why don't we just start to tie things up a little bit? And obviously I want to talk a little bit more about what Calvin mentioned, just the increased focus on surgical smoke evacuation, and kind of diving into maybe what the understanding is amongst clinicians out there and how we can continue to improve the evacuation of that surgical smoke. But can you just describe what the Nebulae SRS is at a really high level?
Sure. So the Nebulae SRS SRS stands for Smoke Removal System. And what's unique about it is that it's closed loop. Closed loop meaning that it pulls the smoky CO2 out of the abdomen. It filters it. It has a subassembly that captures any fluids. And then it pumps that same CO2 that is now clean back into the body. So it being closed loop, it prevents exposure of the patient from outside room air that can be very dangerous. And it, of course, protects the staff from the dangerous surgical plume that develops during laparoscopic surgery. What's unique about SRS is that the pumping mechanism, let's say, is part of the tubing set. It's not part of the device. So the smoky CO2 never touches any part of the device. It's all contained within the disposable that then, of course, gets thrown away. So that's another thing that is very unique. There's no filters to clean within the SRS device. It's all part of the tubing set. Another unique thing with SRS is that there is a warming function. Our inline warmer is an accessory that is compatible with the SRS. So as the CO2 is being recirculated and cleaned, it can actually be warmed. There are positive outcomes that have been linked to using warm CO2 in surgery, from preventive of post-op pain, preventing the scope from fogging up, and other things like that.
Excellent. And so, Calvin, we talked about just the increased focus, right? I mentioned regulatory bodies and industry trade organizations and people talking about it. But honestly, legislation is really leading the way here. Can you kind of talk about how that landscape is changing and how that really impacts the increased focus and awareness that we're seeing in the industry today?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as we're standing here in 2024, we've got 18 states that have enacted legislation to mandate surgical smoke in the OR. We actually did a study back in 2022, though, of 100 surgeons. So just 2 years ago, of 100 surgeons. And in states where that mandate has already been enacted, 70% of those were aware that they had that legislation in place in their state. That means 30% of those surgeons had no idea that there was even legislation passed in their own state. The interesting thing is, beyond that, 34% of that 70% said that they were the only ones who were actually enforcing that mandate. So that there's a lot of room for improvement out there. And I think Melanie would be a great person to attest, just coming from the OR. You know, she's a direct example of somebody who's been experiencing surgical smoke and all the harmful side effects that can come along with that, whether that's headaches or runny nose or nausea or anything like that. So it's pretty exciting that as we are growing, and I'm in Georgia, so I'm proud to say that we're one of those states. Yeah, but we've got a ton of room to go, because it's you know, I was working with a surgeon actually in South Alabama. This was a couple of months ago, and he said, you know, I don't believe in this. You're just the type that is adding to the cost of healthcare. And, you know, surgical smoke is a political issue, right? I mean, in 2024, look at where we're at, our political landscape. And I thought, you know, that's such a shame, because there are people out there, there's data out there, there's studies out there that show all of the harmful things that are in surgical smoke, whether we're talking formaldehyde, hydrogen cyanide, or benzene. You know, it's scary stuff. And I'm like, well, you know, you were probably alive when we could smoke on airplanes, so I can respect your point here, but you got to catch up with the times, man.
Yeah. I don't know. I just feel like I need to jump in, because, I mean, surgical smoke is like, I don't know. I always look at it as cauterized bits of human, and I really don't want to be breathing cauterized bits of people, whether it's got viruses in it or anything else, the cancer, all of the risks. But what's interesting to me, and something that was really a light bulb moment for me, because yes, I've been in the OR for 12 years and done primarily orthopedics. And like the other day, I was scrubbed in assisting with a total knee, and I'm wearing a hood. We're not using smoke evacuation because I'm in Alabama and it is not mandated. And we're not even really in the process of getting legislation passed. And the smoke is coming up. It's getting stuck in my hood. I'm like, you know, like I don't want to breathe, but here we are. But when we tie this idea of surgical smoke, it's not just our open orthopedic or general cases that are generating the smoke that's a risk to our staff and to our patients. Because you think about your laparoscopic cases, and I don't think I ever connected the dots about what happens with our laparoscopic cases. And we put all this gas inside them and we do all of our surgery and then we deflate and then just out it goes. And then all of a sudden we're breathing all this stuff. And so to think about the ramifications of that for our staff, that concentrated amount of surgical smoke exposure, and then to be able to now say, okay, we can actually do something about that. I'm like, yes, please sign me up. But yeah, lots of exposure and lots of things to think about when we're in cases.
So besides the obvious health benefits of using SRS, there's the very positive impact on the environment that SRS presents us compared to other smoke evacuation systems. Just to give you some factoids, a large hospital will use about 10,000 pounds of CO2 per year with using typical smoke evacuation devices that just evacuate the smoke and then deposit it into the atmosphere. So with SRS, the CO2 is recirculated. It's pulled out, clean, put back in, like I said. So 10,000 pounds of CO2, what is that equivalent to? That is equivalent to a car driving about 12,000 miles, a gas-powered car. And it is equivalent to almost 6,000 pounds of burning coal. And it is also the amount of carbon dioxide that almost 6 acres of trees is required in order to sequester. So that's one hospital using SRS. And it does all those positive things for the environment, on top of everything we talk about for the patient and for the staff.
Well, and I read too an article within the last year talked about how hospitals are one of the biggest producers of greenhouse gases and are contributing to environmental effects. And so to have a way to combat that is really cool. I didn't know that was possible with one system.
Well, and I'll tell you too, a lot of the sourcing initiatives for, procurement and strategic sourcing in hospitals are very much looking at that. And they're not just looking at it in terms of, how can we reduce it in our own physical building, but they're also looking at it from their suppliers. Like, what are our suppliers doing to help reduce the environmental, impact and that footprint that we're contributing to that might not even be on site. So this is one of the more obvious ones, Paul and Calvin, where, this is a product that they're choosing to use, not necessarily how it's getting to them and how that's impacting the environment, but very specifically, the usage of CO2 right in their own buildings. I wonder, I'm thinking about how many different hospitals there are, across the country, and you start to total up some of those factoids that you threw out there, Paul. It's got to be pretty significant impact.
I've got a good example of this too, firsthand. A couple of months ago, I was doing a trial at a hospital, and it was a 3-week trial, and I was working with one surgeon pretty frequently. And he had the idea of, hey, Calvin, he had 2 laparoscopic cholecystectomies back to back, which is a pretty smoky procedure. He's like, hey, I just want to try something here. Let's do the first case without the Nebulae SRS. And I just want to see how much CO2 we go through. And then I want to do the second case with the Nebulae SRS and see kind of how much CO2 we go through then. So same surgeon, same procedure, obviously a different patient. But the first case, he used 672 liters of CO2. On the second case, he used 98 liters of CO2. That to me was
really?
Like, wow. Yeah.
That's significant.
Yeah, hugely significant.
And then think about being the circulator in that case. And if you're having to run and get new CO2 canisters and all the other mess so that you can keep it going.
On top of all the other things.
And if you don't have to go lug another one in there, that would be fantastic too. But that's minimal, I know, but I'm the circulator sometimes. So I like that.
Yeah.
There's a cost savings to that too, right? Because if you're using less CO2, you're spending less money on that particular supply. Are there other kind of cost related considerations with the Nebulae SRS? Are there, other ways to kind of reduce costs for hospitals?
I mean, it could be said that the shorter amount of time that a patient is actually under anesthesia and, in the OR, that could be said. If we're constantly removing smoke, and so they're able to have that clear surgical field throughout the entire procedure, they're not having to pause, evacuate smoke, and then they lose their pneumo, and then they have to reinsufflate. So there could be that. That may be kind of a stretch in some people's eyes to use that as a cost savings effect. But realistically, I mean, if you're under anesthesia for less time because we are constantly providing a clear visual field, makes sense to me.
Patient outcomes for sure, right, Melanie? I mean, the longer you're under anesthesia, we know that has an impact on patient outcomes. If the case can be done shorter, patients typically are going to do better post-surgically. What are some of the other features, you're talking a little bit about maybe, impact during the surgery, right? Having a clear, visual field. But what about other things that are easier to use, right? Less trips to go get another canister. Like all these things, really have an impact on maybe operational efficiencies and just making it easier to navigate through, a surgery in general. Just thinking about the improvement, on the quality of life of the clinicians that are involved in that case.
Fresh off my mind because it happened last week. I was working with a surgeon and he was using our inline gas warmer, which essentially after we pull out the surgical smoke, we filter it, clean it out, remove 99.99999% of the contaminants, put that clean CO2 back into the patient. We warm it up. That prevents the fogging of the camera. A huge nuisance in the whole, not just the surgeon, the whole staff's eyes. And he's like, he was holding our gas warmer. This is $1 million idea. This is it. I've been looking for this. And so he's on board just because of the gas warmer. That's a total, it's not ancillary, but it's a total side benefit of the actual device itself, So that was exciting to see. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I was just going to say that most smoke removal devices, if you want to maintain a certain flow, the assumption is there has to be high pressure to generate that flow. But because SRS is the closed system, it allows 10 to 12 liters per minute of smoke evacuation at any pressure. So it's sort of a set it and forget it device. We don't want the surgeon to need to raise and lower the smoke evacuation amount throughout the surgery. It's just one setting. And 10 to 12 liters per minute is what you're going to get. And we have lots of evidence that says that will be everything you need and more to maintain a clear field of vision. Like Calvin said, you can warm that gas too. So it's really got a lot of good stuff.
Too. Maybe this is a tertiary or whatever is below tertiary benefit. However, having been in surgeries with surgeons who get really irritated really quickly and they suddenly get irritated and then they are just impatient or upset. It can happen a lot that camera fogging up or them not being able to see adds to that frustration, adds to their irritation, and it makes things more tense. And then suddenly things are just not pleasant in the OR for the staff. So if you can alleviate even that frustration and irritation because they can see, they're not trying to stop, clean their lens and then keep going, and they can just see what they're doing. Suddenly they are not hindered and they're able to do the job that they came in there to do, and they can do it well because they can see what they're doing. So maybe that's a better benefit than tertiary, but for me it is, because I don't like working with irritated surgeons. But to think about just in maybe a non-financial, but a really good benefit because they're not frustrated and they can see. And I as the patient, I would want my surgeon to be able to see what they were doing on me.
You could even build on that, though, and this may be dramatic, but okay, if the surgeon's in a good mood, the staff is in a good mood. If the staff is in a good mood, they're going to want to come to work. They're not going to be trying to take off when they don't really need to take off. The compounds, right?
Yeah. We can just keep extrapolating here, but still.
Well, quality of work life matters, and workforce retention is a major topic for C-level executives in hospitals today, and being able to retain that staff. And so, again, having that quality of work life, knowing that you're not going to be exposed to surgical smoke and maybe some of the impact as an employee. Obviously, it's a concern, and the benefits to the patient, but as we talked about it really impacts everybody that's in that surgical suite. And so everybody is getting impacted by that. And just knowing that you're going to be exposed to less, that, the facility cares about what is clearly becoming one of the hottest topics in the industry today, and reducing that exposure. And then to your point, Calvin and Melanie, having a more pleasant work environment makes it easier to come to work every day, and, not having to deal with that turnover or the cost of, temporary labor when you are having an issue with retention. All those things add up over time. And I definitely know that this industry is paying more and more attention. And like Melanie, I think, didn't you have a conversation with somebody from maybe AORN on, just how much focus they're putting, in this area?
Yeah, I did. I was at the AORN Guidelines workshop, which they do yearly to update everybody on what's coming out in the new guidelines each year. And we were talking about the AORN guideline for surgical smoke evacuation. And I was talking to one of the writers, and they were very just informative on how AORN has been advocating for surgical smoke evacuation legislation and how they have been working behind the scenes with other organizations to get that documentation and get that support and get the idea across that surgical smoke is dangerous and that it is not healthy for our staff, for our patients, and for anybody to be exposed to. And one of the ways that they had been working with NFPA on the NFPA 99 updated guidelines is to include surgical smoke evacuation wording in that document. And so there's a section in NFPA 99, section 9.3.8, that requires healthcare facilities to capture surgical smoke as close as possible to the point of generation. That is where the energy device contacts the tissue. And so there's different information included in the NFPA 99 document. And so having that wording in another document outside of just AORN's documentation, but other codes that are overseeing how our facilities are managing their environment is actually really encouraging to see that support there too.
Yeah, the NFPA, or the National Fire Protection Association, definitely is an organization that, plant operations and facilities is paying attention to. So really getting that information outside of the clinical regulatory guidelines as well just helps bring in other team members, for increasing awareness, across the healthcare organization.
All right. So we have been talking, Paul, about other documentation and guidelines that are supporting the need for surgical smoke evacuation. We know that legislation is being passed in so many different states already. But then we also mentioned earlier that even though it might be passed, sometimes it's not enforced, or in other states, people just don't want to use surgical smoke evacuation. And one thing that I hear all the time when we have tried to implement it at different facilities I've been in, they say it's too loud. I don't like the noise. So how have you addressed the noise issue?
Well, that's a great question. Noise obviously is very important for the experience in the OR. NTI has a great engineering team, several mechanical, software, and electrical engineers, and we wanted to get this right. SRS right. When we launched it a few years ago, we had every reason to believe that the sound requirement that we met was everything the customer needed. But after the first few cases, we found out that that requirement was not what the customer needed. They needed it quieter. So rather than argue with that and show the data that we had that told us that it was quiet enough, we went back to the drawing board. In a very short amount of time, we released Gen 2, and it reduced 45% of the sound pressure to a point where you can barely hear it in the OR. That's part of the NTI DNA, is to launch as soon as possible, but listen to the customer and produce that second generation that does an even better job of meeting the customer needs. So,
yeah, I love it when I hear companies listening and responding, to feedback from the field. It's so critical. And I can bet a lot of that feedback comes through you, Calvin, and, the trainers that are out there too, and really connecting to the customer and their experience. And, I know one of the things that you also do is kind of, bring some of that information together and share it. And you've done that in the form of a white paper, which anybody who's listening today can call or email to obtain. I'll share some information on how to do that in a minute. But if you can talk just at a high level about what's included in the white paper, and I'm thinking there are probably people out there that maybe are in a state that doesn't have regulation, especially that really want to, collect, resources that outline, how critical it is to address surgical smoke evacuation today. A white paper like this can be, really instrumental in helping push that information forward and make change.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to your point, I'm super grateful to work for a company like this where we are on the smaller side. We're able to be nimble and make changes like this. And you're right, that feedback did come from me and my peers. I've worked for top 5 medical device companies, and it's hard to implement change quickly, but I'm super grateful that we're able to do this with SRS because the outcome is fantastic. But yeah, our white paper, it's called Remove the Smoke, Keep the Pressure. Is it possible to maintain a stable pneumoperitoneum while using an active smoke removal system? There's kind of a perception out there that if you're going to be pulling smoke out, in pulling CO2 out of the pneumoperitoneum, you're going to lose pressure, right? That does make sense. But with the Nebulae SRS, with this white paper, we hosted a study with a number of surgeons, and 100% of them said that the Nebulae SRS is clinically acceptable. So it's pretty exciting that it's just getting our name out there and getting this in front of the right people who can make the decisions. Because once we get out there in front of them, the product kind of sells itself. And in my role as a salesperson, it's pretty great.
Well, yeah, and getting the voice of the surgeons, right? It's one thing, to get feedback from the customer, but it's another thing to address it. And then to that point of just sharing it with others, surgeons want to hear from their colleagues if they're going to make a change, especially if there's kind of a predominant concern with all kinds of different devices that are related to surgical smoke evacuation. Maybe they have something in mind that they've used before or had a colleague that used that it wasn't sufficient, right? And so having that white paper speaking specifically to an area of concern that maybe many surgeons have in this area and saying, hey, we have handled that at our company, I think can be really impactful. And I do want to just let everybody know that if you would like a copy of that white paper, you can contact NTI at sales@ntisurgical.com. You can visit the website, ntisurgical.com, or you can call 847-608-8900. And, as we're kind of wrapping up here, Paul, I really want to talk about the future and what's coming and how you are involved in shaping, continued progress around surgical smoke evacuation. And I know that you're involved in an international work group that is really talking about regulations and standards. Can you tell us about that as we're kind of coming to a close here today?
Sure. So yes, I have the privilege to be part of the working group that meets every 6 months at various places around the globe to discuss the standards and regulations for plume evacuation devices. So, what our goal is we want to make sure that manufacturers like NTI and like others, we are all testing efficiency the same way. We all know what are the standards that must be met in order to bring the best possible devices we can to the surgeons, to the hospitals, and then, of course, to best impact the patients. So the working group I'm part of is specific to surgical smoke removal devices, plume removal devices, but there is growing awareness to the amount of greenhouse gases medical devices use. And in the future, the very near future, I believe there will be more regulations and guidance and expectations for hospitals to limit the amount of greenhouse gases that they use. So SRS would be a way to be in front of all that. If there's going to be caps to how much greenhouse gas a hospital can use, well, SRS would be a great way to reduce the impact if there are new regulations like that down the road.
All right, Paul. Well, I want to congratulate you and your team on the good work in developing the Nebulae SRS and also just staying involved in the industry and shaping the future of surgical smoke evacuation and even just the total impact that healthcare organizations have on the environment. It's always good to take a step back and look at that from a big picture too, the cumulative effect that every single product, supply, or service that's being provided to a hospital, how it all kind of comes together, in aggregate that way. And knowing what part you can play as an organization is really incredible. So congratulations on that work. And Calvin, as we're kind of wrapping up, any final thoughts?
I guess I would say I just want to reiterate the importance of having a closed loop surgical smoke removal system, because there are other systems out there that remove surgical smoke, but then they will filter it and put that into the OR. The Nebula SRS is completely closed loop, meaning that none of those contaminants of the smoke ever get into the OR, down to the point where that disposable tubing set, they actually have lure locks on them that are spring loaded. So as soon as it comes off the trocar, it's closed, and all of those contaminants remain in that tubing set that's then thrown out. So it's really important, as the awareness of the contaminants found in surgical smoke are becoming more and more popular, to understand that there is a solution out there that is entirely closed loop. And that's what we have with Nebula SRS. So just wanted to bring that home again. And, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all.
Well, safety is priority number one. Gentlemen, Thank you for contributing to the safety of our patients and the staff working in the hospitals every day, and for joining Melanie and I on the First Case podcast today.
Absolutely.
Thank you for
Our
having us.
pleasure. Thanks for having us.
That was Paul Fowler, Director of Engineering, and Calvin Hersom, Sales Trainer with Northgate Technologies, Inc., and we were talking everything surgical smoke evacuation today. And honestly, the reduction in CO2 usage is also very impressive. But I think at the end of the day, anytime we have a company come on this podcast and talk about how well they listen to the customer, even when they've done their studies and their studies say that they have done everything that they need to be doing, and they still get feedback from the customer and they go that extra mile, which in this case had to do with the noise and making the SRS much more quiet. I just love hearing that. It really resonates with me. And obviously the theme of surgical smoke, it's very near and dear to your heart because you're still working out there every single day. Obviously a huge focus in the industry and plenty of opportunity for improvement still.
I am still working in the OR, and I see surgical smoke plume, and I see it every time that I work. And the more I learn about surgical smoke, the less I want to be exposed to it. And then as we got into the topic of laparoscopic procedures and the surgical smoke that is still produced, even though you don't see it at the time because it's inside the patient, that smoke still has to go somewhere. And so actually having a product that can remove that smoke while the surgeon can still maintain their visual field, maintain their pneumoperitoneum, all of those things that make the surgery go smoother and quicker, makes everybody happy, keeps everybody safer. It's a win-win.
Well, I think everybody should be requesting this white paper because as you look at, putting in new technologies to help you tackle this problem, Melanie, you mentioned it yourself and we talked about it. There are, some complications for some surgeons in adopting this kind of technology, like, again, maintaining that pressure. And so I think getting some testimonials from other customers can really help, maybe reinvigorate a conversation that fell off previously, or if you haven't even started the conversation, can be so helpful. You can reach out to NTI at 847-608-8900 to request a copy of that white paper. You can send them an email, sales@ntisurgical.com. You can visit their website, ntisurgical.com. If you have any questions just about how involved they are, or maybe you want to get more involved in making efforts to improve surgical smoke evacuation and reduce risk and increase safety, certainly reach out to them. They're going to be available at a number of upcoming trade shows as well, so I'm sure you'll see them there. And on behalf of Melanie and myself, I want to thank you all for listening to this Vendor Spotlight today on First Case.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.